I had been restoring buildings in the historic district and came across a property, the Starland area, that was for sale. It took up 2 city blocks, so it was a large piece of property. And the people that had been, the other people interested in purchasing the property were all interested in tearing it down. With a degree in historic preservation from SCAD, I saw that as a terrible thing to happen to it. But the neighborhood was just incredibly depressed at the time, so it was hard to imagine what you could do with 2 city blocks in a neighborhood that nobody wanted to go into. So Greg and I revisited ideas we'd had years before about how do you build a creative arts-based community, and we had planned this in various empty buildings around town and other cities, and just talked about how these things can be done. And we realized that creating a creative community centered on the Starland area could be the catalyst to help revitalize the whole neighborhood. So we got the dairy under contract, and being in our 20s, we had no money to pay for it. So it took us 18 months until we found investors who would give us the down payment money just to be able to get it going. In the meantime, we both had track records buying and restoring individual houses, so we were able to start purchasing vacant houses in the neighborhood, including these on 41st Street, and start restoring them while trying to explain to people the creative community that we were wanting to start. We started with cataloging everything in the neighborhood, so we had an understanding of where buildings had once been that had been torn down through the years, whether the condition of the building was occupied, unoccupied, whether it was commercial, residential, civic uses. And we realized at that point that over half of the houses in the neighborhood were boarded up and vacant. Over almost 75% of the commercial spaces were boarded up and vacant. So we were dealing with a neighborhood that was very depressed. But that's also why it was very inexpensive to get into it. And the only interest for the neighborhood was that it was zoned mostly light industrial, so people that were interested in coming in here were interested in buying as much property as possible, tearing it down, and putting in whatever light industrial use they needed, whether it was a lot for a towing company that was looking at one, a plumbing warehouse, that sort of thing. Every house on this block on 41st Street had been organized and put up for sale by a real estate agent, and she had managed to contact every single owner of every house. They were all owned by different people, and the lots that are beside it, every lot, it was all owned by different individuals, and put them up for sale with the idea that someone would come in and tear down everything on this block, buy the street from the city, close it off, and turn it into whatever kind of light industrial use they wanted for the area. So we realized that not only was there an opportunity to make things better, but there were people actively working to make things worse in terms of what makes a good urban neighborhood. So we had to jump on the properties that there was a focus to tear them down, which was this entire block and the Starland dairy, and we were able to get the houses here under contract and get the dairy under contract, and that's when we used that time to put together our plans. We brought in a good friend, Christian Sotil, an urban planner. This was actually the first project he ever had, and he helped us put together visual aids so that we could explain to people what was happening. We spent 18 months going to every group we could find in the city that would let us speak to them so that we could just tell them what we were looking for. We'd already been turned down by every bank. And going to Rotary clubs, garden clubs, neighborhood associations, and explaining to them what our plans were. Pretty much everybody laughed at us. Every once in a while there were a few people that were interested in historic buildings that saw some value to it. But for the most part, everybody just thought that there was no use even trying to save this neighborhood. It was because of Whitaker Street and Drayton Street, people looked at it as a thoroughfare that you just sped through as quickly as possible. And we used visuals to start giving people an understanding. And after 6 months of people just literally laughing at us as we were trying to explain what would happen, we pulled up this visual, which I don't know if you guys can see very well, and we were able to demonstrate why this neighborhood physically was important. We were able to show people that the historic district was restored. It was a great neighborhood. The Victorian district at the time was starting to be restored, and people knew it was going to be a good neighborhood. South of Starland was Ardsley Park, a wonderful neighborhood, never had to be restored. Everything had always been restored, or everything was always in good condition. And then we had this, which was the Thomas Square neighborhood, metropolitan neighborhood, and the edge of Jackson Park. And when we showed them this, it was like a light bulb going off in people's head. Instead of an entire room of people laughing at us, you have people going, oh, I get this. This is clearly logically the next spot that needs to be restored. It will join all of these pieces together. And I mean, I can't overestimate the power that that very simple drawing had. After a banker that had listened to us this was his third time listening to us, and the first time he saw this, and after he saw this, he came up to us at the end of I think it was a Rotary Club meeting, and he said, okay, I think I can help you guys. He said, I work in a department of a bank, SunTrust Bank, that deals in very large loans. What you're looking for is smaller than what my department typically does, but I've been listening to you guys now for almost a year, and your story just keeps getting better, and you're starting to make progress on various small buildings, and you're starting to build this idea of a community. He says, I think we can make this happen. And he then told us all we needed was a big pile of cash as a down payment, which we knew we were going to need. At the same time, we'd been trying to find people interested in that would be interested in loaning us or investing in the project. And a friend said that there was a woman that he had just met who just moved into town, and that she might be interested in speaking with us. And we approached her. She said she would talk with us. We met her at her house, and we went over all of this. We explained to her that the kind of community we were wanting to build, and at the end of the meeting, she gave us a check for $250,000, our down payment that we needed. I never believed anybody could do that kind of thing, and it was just a total shock. But we knew we were getting somewhere, and as soon as we went to the banker and said, look, we now have the money to use as the down payment on the dairy, he said, okay, we're going to make this happen. We're going to find a way to make this happen. And it took 6 more months to make that happen, and by then we had started restoring a couple of these houses. We had 22 East 41st Street restored and 28 East 41st Street restored. And 28 East 41st Street is the corner building on the corner of Drayton and 41st Street. At that point, we said, okay, it's time to start getting people into this neighborhood and actually showing them what we're talking about. So we had in 2000 the very first Starland First Friday, and it was one building, one exhibit, but it was contemporary art, and it was the first time contemporary art had been shown in Savannah. Even SCAD's 2 galleries that they had at the time were involved in Old World Masters. SCAD wasn't even showing in any of their galleries contemporary art. We knew that as soon as people understood that there was an outlet for viewing contemporary art, for buying contemporary art, and more importantly for creating contemporary art, that this was going to be the linchpin that would make the neighborhood work. We had great publicity for the first opening. We thought we'd end up having, we were hoping to have 150 people show up, and we had 700 people show up. The front porch of the house actually had to be jacked up afterwards because there were so many people on it that the porch lowered like 4 inches during our first exhibit. We knew at that point that we were onto something, that there was a craving for a creative community. And we quickly learned that not only were there artists in Savannah that wished they could be creating work here, but there were people in Savannah making it in their garages, their attics, wherever, and they were selling it outside of Savannah. We didn't realize that there were contemporary artists here, but they found zero market here, but they loved the city. So they were working hard to create their work, but then exhibiting it outside of the town. So they quickly came into the fold and wanted to show their work. Then we found SCAD professors coming to us left and right saying, I'm a part of an art school, but in no way do I get to be an artist myself. How can I be a part of what's going on? I want to show my work. I want to help organize exhibits. And at the same time, we started finding vacant buildings that we could rent as cheaply as possible and put artist studios into them. So within that first year, we had 12 exhibits. Once a month, we started having an exhibit, and we moved 35 artists into studio spaces in the neighborhood. They're paying as low as $25 a month for studio space. The studio spaces, the $25 ones usually had several buckets collecting the rain that was leaking through the roof. And we had nice spaces, but for the most part they were very basic. But we created a community very quickly with those spaces, and we found that not only were the artists having a space where they could create their work, but they were building instantly this amazing community of artists where they were spending their time together, working together. They wanted to be in their studio when they knew someone else was in their studio working. Suzanne Jackson, who was the dean of the painting department, so the first time she realized as she was painting in her studio that the clanging sound she was hearing was the ironsmith that was in the building next behind her, that he was in there making work. She said it was like music hearing this, knowing that, oh my God, there's an artist here in this neighborhood right behind me who's making art. We were able to expand the galleries. Marcus Kinney came in. Marcus Kinney is a prominent local artist. At the time, he had just finished graduate school and was looking to have his own shows, and he started organizing First Friday for us, and he started bringing in all of his artist friends, and First Friday started getting recognition around the state. We started hearing from artists that were outside of Savannah and in Savannah that we still hadn't met, and before we knew it, we had a thriving artist community in all of these buildings, vacant houses, individual spaces, and we still hadn't closed on the dairy. The whole reason that this was going to happen. And by the time we were able to finally close on that and get our first construction loan, we had revamped our plans to restoring what was on DeSoto Avenue, which was at the time just a large freezer, 2,000 square foot freezer, and a building that the dairy had used as a machine tool shop, and the house above it that the general manager for the dairy had lived in for 25 years. And we restored those spaces. We turned them into very small live-work spaces. Any of the spaces could be lived in. They could also be just a studio space, but they were as small as 275 square feet and up to 1,400 square feet. But every space had an ability to open up to the space beside it, so that if somebody was going to expand, they could. And what we found was these little spaces were the perfect incubators. People that could afford a bigger space wanted to be downtown because it was where they felt all the business would be. People that were really trying to get something going, didn't have the money to put a ton of money into starting their business, their creative business, could really fit into these spaces. They were as low as $350 a month, including your utilities, bathroom, everything you needed, and they quickly filled up. And we then restored the corner spot where back in the day bakery was. We spent a long time trying to find a business that would go into there as we were restoring it, that would be a business that would be good for the neighborhood, something that was going to bring people into the neighborhood. As we were restoring that, we were restoring the space just down the street from it, which is where Central Animal Hospital is. We knew we needed, again, in that great big space, it needed to be a business that was going to bring people into the neighborhood. The first tenant where back in the day was waiting on the space where Central Animal Hospital is to be finished, and it was Images Everything, a printing company. And they, at the time, students were most of their customers, and we knew that bringing in their 50 to 75 customers a day were going to be all creative people coming into this neighborhood, a neighborhood they would never go into otherwise, to get to that business. So we got them into their space. They were there for a number of years, and eventually outgrew it, and we went seeking another business that would be great for the neighborhood. Central Animal Hospital brought in an average of 150 customers a day, and we thought, geez, 150 customers a day coming into this neighborhood would be a huge boon, because that would double the number of people coming into this neighborhood for any kind of business at that point. And at that point, we were just finishing back in the day bakery. We knew that they would also be a tremendous contributor to the space, outfitting it specifically for them. Back in the day, moved in and opened up, and basically put a great big bright flag out there that said, this neighborhood is open for business. And they started drawing people in with their amazing baked goods, and that's what started it. From that point, we just continued to grow the gallery spaces we had, the studio spaces we had, and we continued restoring buildings. We either restored each house on this block or sold them to somebody who we knew could restore them. Again, we couldn't borrow enough money to do everything we wanted to do at the time, so we were able to either restore or sell every house on this block and get them restored. And at about that time, we started talking about what to do with some of the empty land on the dairy site, and we knew we wanted to build new construction that was the greenest building possible. And at the time, nobody was thinking about green buildings, and they were starting to talk about it, but we had to really do our research. And we met a gentleman who introduced us to leadership in energy environmental design, and we started researching that, and we realized that following their methods was going to give us the kind of buildings we wanted. So we started talking about, well, what kind of construction could we do that would be green, and we came across through another friend the idea of making concrete buildings that were panels. So at the same time we were looking at green, we were also starting this idea of prefab construction, which actually was still 10 years away from people really starting to talk about what prefab construction was going to be like. But we were able to build what is now the Starland Lofts. We built 14 commercial spaces and 13 residential lofts, and they were the first LEED certified buildings in Savannah, in Georgia. First LEED certified residences. So when they were finished, they were certifiably the greenest residences ever built in Georgia. We found that people were super anxious, and before we finished construction, every space was leased and sold. I mean, way before we finished, like just a few months into construction, we had everything sold and leased. And at that point, we knew, we're like, okay, people are ready to finally start moving into the neighborhood. And using these same maps, this one in particular, which showed where every building was in the neighborhood, where buildings had been in the neighborhood, and what the uses were. Other people started coming in and seeing how they could buy a house in the neighborhood, buy a commercial building, or open up a business, and see their relationship to everything else that was going on. It wasn't just us talking about things. We were able to say, you know, this is the dairy, you know, these houses up here being restored by a friend of ours, you know, this house up here has been bought by a friend of ours, this house here, you know, and demonstrate what was happening. And this then really started filling in the blanks for people in terms of how they were going to become a part of the neighborhood.